Good evening, everyone. Happy Tuesday evening. It's Tuesday after Memorial Day weekend, which actually is like a Monday. So, kind of happy pseudo Monday to everyone. I want to thank you for being here. We've got one of you in the chat room, two of you. I'm just going to chatter away for a little bit till people start filing in a bit. And I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for following these readings I'm doing. I appreciate it very much. And if you've missed any of the previous chapters, you can just go back into my videos, and I've got them all lined up in a section. June, good to see you. Thank you. I will chatter away for a little bit here. And I just want to remind you all that after this program, I'm going to be on with Rocky Stucci at midnight Eastern, 11 p.m. Central Standard Time, which is 9 p.m. West Coast time. And Rocky Stucci and I in the Situation Room. And we'll be, I got a lot of uhs going on, don't I? And we'll be hitting some current events, topic driven, and hope to see you there right after this. I know I've seen a bunch of you over there on other nights. So thank you for being there as well. I think I'll just get this out of the way too right away. Go to my website, scottallenroberts.com, and you can see all the stuff I do. I'm a graphic designer. I'm an illustrator, photographer, writer, all of those things. You can hire me, or you can just go look at my stuff. That'll be fun. If you click on my articles link, you'll see a bunch of links to things I've written over at my academia.edu site. And also, what else is on there? Oh, you can see the books I've done and click on the links over there as well. So Lucky Stone, it says, I didn't get notified. I just remembered you'd be on. Glad you're here, Lucky. I'm not sure what it is with the notifications. I have no power or control over that. I've heard that on Jeffrey's show. I've heard that on Rocky's show as well. We set up these reminders and put it up, but they don't always get out to everybody. Make sure if you're not subscribed, subscribe. If you haven't hit the little bell, hit that little bell icon, and that'll keep you notified. Hey, Gemma, how you doing? Good to see you here. And tonight, we're going to continue on where we left off with the Exodus reality. Now, if you saw the graphic for tonight's show, I put that up there. That's a photo that I took at the tomb of Rechmir, who was one of the Grand Viziers during the reigns of Tutmosis III and into his son, Amenhotep II. Now, he was well into his 80s when Tutmosis III died, and he retained his position as Grand Vizier underneath Amenhotep II, who I believe was the pharaoh of the Exodus. And Rechmir didn't last too many more years after that, and he was gone. But this was at his tomb, and on the tomb walls, you see these paintings of all these servants enslaved and slaves and indentured workers making mud bricks, doing all kinds of things. And so it's very interesting. If you look at that graphic for tonight's show, I took that picture. It's up about 12 feet off the ground, and you see all those different slaves. And if you remember, I mentioned when we were talking about the statue, what they think is the statue of Joseph at Avaris, that it's got the yellow skin painted, which is what the Egyptians did to color the skin tones in these relief paintings of whom they referred to as the Asiatics, or the Canaanite peoples, the Mesopotamian, Middle East, places like that. And so that's a very interesting little scene up on the walls at Rechmir's tomb. And it's got the mix of African, Egyptian slaves, Ethiopian, and of course the Asiatics, or the Canaanite peoples. They painted a lighter color in yellow. And also along with that, in that same relief, somewhere else on the wall, it's got a taskmaster. If you remember the biblical story of Moses murdering the taskmaster, it's got a taskmaster there, and he's got a rod in his hand. And it says, do not, basically, it says, don't screw off because I've got the rod in my hand. So very interesting stuff over there. Fran, good to see you. Jeannie, nice to see you as well. And let's get, we'll kind of get rolling. You know, where we left off reading was it Friday night or Saturday night? I think it was Friday night. And we were talking about the strangers in a not so strange land. And we left off talking about the Asiatics, the new pharaoh who had come to power, Amos the First, who, remember, the biblical text says the new pharaoh came to power, and he didn't know Joseph. It says in the Old English, the King James, it says a new pharaoh rose up who knew not Joseph. In other translations, it'll tell you who had no regard for Joseph, who had no knowledge of Joseph, or not enough knowledge to give him any regard. And this is a pharaoh who rose up and drove out the Hyksos. And I believe Joseph came in to power at the right time underneath the Hyksos, when his brothers sold him into slavery, and he started interpreting dreams in Egypt. And he was accused of rape. He was a victim of the old ancient Me Too movement, that any woman who says anything is to be believed, especially if she's the upper class over a prisoner or a slave. So he was thrown in prison because the husband couldn't take his word officially over the word of his wife, and that he wasn't killed on the spot. Joseph says that his master Potiphar held him in pretty high regard. And so Joseph was raised to great power, and he was there. And if you are a believer in the faith story, as Joseph said to his brothers when he revealed himself to them, he said, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." He said, because these 20 years now, or however many years had passed, we don't know exactly. Joseph was raised to power from being a slave and being a prisoner, accused of rape. And the Pharaoh put him into high position. And then the Pharaoh, when his brothers came, remember, he told his brothers, now, when you go into Pharaoh, I've given you the best land, but you've got to make a presentation to him. When you do, he says, tell the Pharaoh that that you're shepherds, and that you've been shepherds from the days of your youth, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. And I thought, why would Joseph, I'm recapping a little, why would Joseph tell his brothers to tell the Pharaoh of Egypt something that he hates, that they're shepherds? Well, I think it's because he was one of the Hyksos kings, which was known as the shepherd kings, that took over the north of Egypt for a little over 100 years. And Joseph, when he presented himself, or his brothers, and they said, we're shepherds and have been from the days of our youth, that one of the shepherding kings, if you will, those people that held the northern throne, would have recognized them. And the Egyptians in the south hated these people. So there's a real clue in that passage of the timing and when Joseph, when all this happened. Hey, James, good to see you. James Sheets Jr., good to see you, sir. And glad you're here. And Lewis, good to see you too, brother. Richie, nice to see you. And glad you're here. I want to see if I missed anybody while I was yammering away. Okay, that's pretty much it in the chat room so far. I want to welcome you here and thank you for being here. Now, remember, if you've missed any of these episodes on this book or in my last two books I read, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim and The Secret History of the Reptilians, you can go back into my videos here and you can listen to any of those in the archive. So glad you're here, and you don't have to miss a dime on any of this stuff. So this chapter tonight is not a super long chapter. It's roughly 14 pages long. But this is where one of the big questions came in for John and I as we were devising our separate theories was, were the Hebrew slaves really Hebrews? And were they really slaves? And Hebrew is probably a misnomer That's what they're called in the Bible. They were Israelites. They were the children of Jacob, Israel. And several hundred years had passed. Well, several makes it sound like more than it was. I think at least 200 years had gone by since Joseph was first there and his brothers came down with the family. And it might be up to 400 years, depending on the dating system and how you look at these things. Now, I want you to keep in mind when I start mentioning the pharaohs and John starts mentioning the pharaohs in this book, remember the book of Exodus, as Moses wrote it, didn't have the names of these kings. And so we're kind of doing a little guessing game. And we thought it would be so much easier to date the Exodus, to date Moses, to try to find out more about these characters if we knew when they actually lived and who are the pharaohs that Moses was referencing. Who was the Pharaoh's daughter that found Moses in the Nile and ended up adopting him? So all of these questions hinge on, now that you look back and you're trying to date it, hinges on the dating system. And there are 4 chronologies of the kings of Egypt, and they vary each from another. Sometimes just a matter of a handful of years, depending on how long one compiler of the chronology of the kings looked at the pharaohs and said, well, that guy was actually a co-regent, so we're not going to count his dates as co-regent. We'll count his dates of his actual single reign, and it changes the dates and the dating system around. I have, and John has, for the sake of this book, stuck fairly close to the accepted Oxford chronology of the kings of Egypt. Now, we drift a little bit, vary a little bit on things, but when I'm looking at dates and I'm trying to place Amos the first and his grandson, Tutmosis the first, and then Tutmosis the second and the third, Hatshepsut, Senenmut, Amenhotep the second, all these guys, to put them all into a framework that fits the narrative, I've got to make sure I'm not constructing that narrative to fit the preconceived notions set up in the story in the Bible. So what I've got to do is the reverse. You look at history and you see if the biblical tale matches the details. And in our cases, they really do. And you have to start picking and choosing which way you're going to go. So yeah, Jama, it says 400 years, but you can look at the dating systems like this, where it says the Israelites dwelt in the land, were in hard bondage for 400 years. Take a look at the passages in the New Testament, in the Jewish way of thinking, that first century Judea, when they talked about when Jesus died and was buried in the tomb and rose again, they said it was 3 days and 3 nights. When in actuality, he died on Friday, was buried on Friday, and was resurrected Sunday morning, which is, by my reckoning, roughly a 36-hour period, not 72. So it's half that period of time, because they would count portions of days and nights and call them a full day, a full night, a full day, a full night, full day, a full night. And that's really what you've got going on with the 400 years. I don't think there was 400 years that passed, but there were portions of centuries, if you will, that took place. And so you might have as little as, 2 centuries had gone by from the time of Joseph and Jacob and his brothers settling in the land and the birth of Moses, or even the Exodus, which was 80 years later. Even in Moses' lifetime, you've got the better chunk of a century from the moment of his birth until the Exodus, according to the biblical tale. So Moses, by the dating system I used, was born into the first year of the reign of Tutmosis I, which was 1526. Now, that's not strictly in accordance to the Oxford dating system, but it fits, it works. And when we'll get into some of that into the book here as we get later into my theories. So that's when, and then when Moses, by the way, when he was 40, would have been in 15, I'm doing the math in my head, 1526 to 1486. So around 1486, Moses would have been 40, and or who I believe he was, Senenmut, and he fled Egypt after murdering an Egyptian taskmaster. And he was no slave. He wasn't like Charlton Heston. I'm going to go identify with my people and go down into the mud pits. It said that he, on the scene where he murdered the Egyptian, it even says in the scripture that he arrived, he and his entourage. So he had a royal entourage. And so in 1486 would have been about the date Moses would have been 40, thereabouts. And then, of course, he's gone for 40 years, comes back as the older Moses in his 80s, and the Exodus takes place, which would have been 1446, which would have placed Amenhotep II on the throne, who was in his 5th year of his reign. Well, I don't know what I'm hearing up there. I don't know if that picked up on the microphone, but I'm hearing all kinds of banging around upstairs. Kids dropping things or knocking over furniture. So there you go, Jem. I hope that helps and that answers that. Does King Tut fit in here somewhere? Asks Lewis. No, King Tut would have been a few generations down the line. If you remember, Tutankhamun is the son of Akhenaten. Akhenaten is the same as Amenhotep IV, who is the son of Amenhotep III. And my guy for the Exodus was Amenhotep II. So that gives you an idea. And so we're looking roughly 100 years down the road from the time when I place Moses as Senenmut, another 100 years down the road before you hit King Tut. TT, good to see you. Nice to have you here. All right, so why don't we do this? Why don't we just jump in and get rolling? This is chapter 5, and it's entitled, Were the Hebrew Slaves Ever Really Hebrew Slaves? And this is in my thread, the Senenmut thread. If you remember, just quick recap, John and I divided our chapters on our different theories based on the Hapu thread, which was John's, the Senenmut thread, which was mine. And Senenmut is sitting right back here over my shoulder, right over my microphone. If I look at the point of my finger, that's his head right there in the background behind me. That little statuette, that's the one that John Ward had done for me. If I move my mic out of the way for a second, there you can see the pedestal he's sitting on with the hieroglyphs. Nefruri, the daughter of Amenhotep II, and his sister wife Hatshepsut, and then Senenmut being the royal tutor, whom she also elevated to great status in Egypt. To be a tutor in Egypt for the royal house wasn't a school marm job. It wasn't like being a substitute teacher. They generally used high nobility, or it was retired generals, people of this kind of status became the tutors to the young princes and princesses. And so we'll get into that more later in the book. But that's my guy right back there, Senenmut. All right, here we go. The Hebrews had grown far too numerous. Over the last generation, the lush, fertile Nile Delta had become their permanent home. They had emigrated there seeking refuge from the bitter famine that overtook the Canaanite region, and now these Asiatics were here to stay. They were beginning to overpopulate the land that had been given to them by the vizier Zaphnath-Paneah, known to their people as Joseph, the younger son of their patriarch, Jacob, known as Israel. The eastern Nile Delta, where the Hebrews abandoned their nomadic ways, sinking their foreign feet into the most beautiful, lush part of the region known as Goshen. By the way, it's just east of Cairo, where present day, well, it's not really present day because the city's not there as an active city, but where the city of Avaris was, and on top of Avaris, Ramses II built Pi-Ramses, the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. The eastern Nile, let's see, let me move ahead. It held some of the richest soil in all of Egypt. The Pharaoh who had elevated Joseph to power as his vizier is the same Pharaoh who had also given this land to the Hebrews. but he was not an Egyptian pharaoh at all. It's more than likely that he was one of the shepherd kings, the Heka Kasheshet, the Semitic race of Hyksos peoples. The Heka, here, I'll give you the Egyptian spelling, Heqa space Khaseshet, the Heka Kaseshet, which is the same as the Hyksos. So they were the Semitic race of the Hyksos people from Syria and Canaan, who had migrated to and infiltrated Egypt in a similar fashion as did the Hebrews. Hyksos is the Greek translation of the Egyptian phrase Heka, there it is again, Heka Keseshet. But there is newer etymology of the word Hyksos from Egyptian Heku Sheshu. Heka Sheshu became Hyksos, meaning Bedouin-like shepherd kings, rendered simply rulers of or from foreign lands. Archaeologist Jacquette Hawkes states of the Hyksos, quote, "It's no longer thought that the Hyksos rulers represent the invasion of a conquering horde of Asiatics. They were wandering groups of Semites who had long come to Egypt for trade and other peaceful purposes. Their usurpation of the throne of Egypt was a gradual affair as they worked their way into the Egyptian politics and governmental affairs over generations. From migrating shepherds to Egyptian kings, the foreign nomadic Bedouins became rulers of the Nile Delta and all of Lower Egypt, while Egyptian pharaohs ruled from Thebes in the south of Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt being south, Lower Egypt being north. And this is because of the way the Nile flowed. The Nile actually flows north into the Mediterranean. So upper was near the beginning of the source of the Nile. Lower was toward the Mediterranean, up in the Nile Delta. Let's see, Hitchcock today. Not sure where you're going with that one. Might have to explain that one to me, Gemma. So eventually, the Hyksos went even further. I see. Itzhak. I see what you're saying, Jama. Right. Very possibly. I haven't looked in the etymology of Hitchcock or Itzhak, but the Hyksos, it's got that similar tone. And it's something, by the way, the way language works, if I'm going to rabbit trail off here for a second, I saw one of Jeff's shows where he was talking about the sons of God, the Elohim. Jeff and I love Jeff to death. Great friends, a lot of respect for each other. I have a little different take on that than he does. He mentioned the sons of God and that sons was a word that meant simply physical sons born of women. And whereas I see that in a different light, hopefully on Thursday night this week, day after tomorrow, we'll be able to do another consequential rapscallions, I do declare, Jeffrey and I. We always seem to have something that comes in the way of that show. I think that's probably one of the least important shows on the docket because it gets cut so easily. We have so many conflicts with that one. But maybe we'll talk about that and the way linguistics work, because the sons of God in English is rendered in the Hebrew the B'nai Ha-Elohim, those who are of the Elohim, the sons of or those of the Elohim, the God of many gods. So maybe we'll talk about that. I love Jeff. Jeff is riveting. I've learned a hell of a lot of stuff from Jeff. And we've got our little tiny bits and pieces that we disagree on. And the word disagree makes it sound negative. It's not even negative. Just things that we hold different points of view on. And so maybe one of these days he'll pull me over to his side on some of those things. Maybe I'll pull him over to my side. But linguistics is very important. You were talking, this came off of looking at Jama presented Itzhak, that word coming off of Hyksos. Very possible. You're probably right. I haven't looked at it myself. So to see that that's a connection, believe it or not, with all the years I've been doing this, I never looked at that connection to that name. But I know that it's like the name Enoch, where Jeff was talking about Enoch. Enoch is the same word linguistically as Uruk, which is the same word as, in our modern English, Iraq. So when it says that Cain left Eden, went east to the land of Nod, married a wife, had a son, named him Enoch. Then he built a city and named the city after his son, Enoch. Well, through linguistics, we know that the E becomes a U sound, the N becomes an R sound, and the CH retains that CH to a Q. And it's a long, drawn out process. It take us 10 minutes to go through it, but the etymology of the word Iraq comes from Enoch or Enoch. And Enoch is not, I know Jeff presented Noah and backwards and so on. I don't think that works so well. And he and I can talk about that as well, because Enoch is really the word Iraq. So it's very interesting. And the name translates the same way, city name or personal pronoun. So it's interesting stuff. Anyway, so let's get back into this. ISIS, Israel, says Kat. I don't know about that. Because it might be because Jacob, known as Israel in the Old Testament, that name may have been taken from ISIS. You're absolutely correct. Israel, El being the name for God, Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon, El. You see it in all the archangel names: Michael or Michael, Gabriel, Azazel. All of those different names that ended with El were denoting God's name. El, they were of God. And so Israel was, I don't know if it was Isis of God. And so Jacob, and God gave him the name. His name was Jacob. And God said, "You shall forevermore be known as Israel." So it's very interesting stuff. So without getting into the days of Noah, cannoli, no baloney. I like that, Jeannie. Thank you. And by the way, just to reemphasize, love Jeff. Respect, a huge hell of amount of respect for Jeff, and love everything he has to say. We just take little different points of view on little things. Overall, we're pretty much in line. So let's see. And it's the unimportant stuff, by the way. So let's go on. Let me start that sentence over. Eventually, the Hyksos went even further than simple migration. And by the 15th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom, around 1700 to 1650 BCE, they had wrested the ruling power of the north, Lower Egypt, from the Egyptians, and established and held that pharaonic throne until they were ousted at the beginning of the New Kingdom around 1600 to 1550 by Ahmose I, who had already been on the Theban throne in the south of Upper Egypt for some time before. Ahmose invaded the north, and he drove the Kamudi, the last of the Hyksos rulers, out of Mennefer, which is Memphis, and the entire Nile Delta region. There's a little picture here. This is a palm forest. John and I were at Saqqara, the stepped pyramid of Saqqara, which is outside of Mennefer or Memphis. And I wish we could have had these pictures in color in the book. And maybe I'll find a place and I'll put all these pictures up in color again where you can see them. You actually can, come to think of it. If you go to my Facebook page, you start scrolling through my hundreds of thousands of photos that are up in my photo albums. As you scroll through my albums, you'll find all these Egyptian albums from 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, all these different times I was over in Egypt, and you'll be able to see a hell of a lot of these photos. But this was alongside the road. We just stopped. We stopped at a little place and just looked out, and this is a palm forest that surrounded where we were, near the stepped pyramid of Djoser, near Saqqara. So this is the region we're talking about, by the way. So moving on. According to the biblical account of the Hebrew migration of Egypt under Joseph and the Hyksos Pharaoh and Menefer, the Egyptians were none too fond of foreign shepherding peoples, and Joseph expressly told his brothers to mention to the Pharaoh that they were shepherds, as we already talked about. This directly supports the fact that the sitting Pharaoh at the time of Joseph is none other than a Hyksos ruler, one of the shepherding kings, the rulers of or from foreign lands. Hey, Audrey, how you doing? You're not late. You're just early for tomorrow night's show. So good to have you here. Thank you, Suze, by the way. Good to see you, Suze. And Kat, I don't think I said hello when you came in. Good to have you. Now, let's see. I threw this little graphic in. There's not really much to it other than it looked really cool in color when I made it, and then we did it in black and white, and it was not fun. But down along the side of the margin here, I'm showing you Egypt and the Nile. The Nile Delta is all the way up into here. This is the Delta area. It's really small. Menefer would be sitting right there at the tip of the Delta. And then you go downstream about 400 miles. Luxor's in this little loop. And you come all the way down to Aswan now. And keep in mind, when they flooded Aswan, they flooded it when they put in the dam in the 60s, 1960s. And that's why they had to move the big monuments of Ramses II. They moved them mathematically, bit by bit, up the hillside, so they kept the same alignment with the sun. And that's Abu Simbel. And you've seen it with the big 4 statues of Ramses seated outside that temple. So now, according to the biblical account, we've gone through that. The biblical passage of Genesis 46:31 through 34 gives clues to the nature of Pharaoh and the ruling class in Egypt at the time of Joseph's story, lending plausibility to the notion that the entire account of Joseph's time in Egypt and the migration of his father's clan from Canaan took place while a Hyksos ruler sat on the throne of Egypt, placing it sometime during the 15th dynasty. And it makes perfect, indirect, albeit plausible sense. The Pharaoh who favored the shepherding people from Canaan, while the rest of the Egyptians detested them, is the one who grants the family of Jacob, Israel, the finest land in all of Egypt. After all, they're his people. And this passage says this from Genesis. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who were living in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock, and they brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. So you can see he's politicized. He's playing politics a bit. You know, I know you love the shepherding peoples. We're known as the shepherding kings. Well, my family, my brothers, were all shepherds, and they tend to goats and sheep and everything else. And they've been doing that since they were kids. And our whole family does that, by the way, for generations. They've come up. And so when Pharaoh calls you in, he says to his brothers, and asks, what's your occupation? You should answer, your servants have tended livestock from the days of our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Now, it's no wonder that the new Pharaoh mentioned in Exodus 1:8, Amos the first, who ruled 1550 to 1525 BC, had absolutely no regard for Joseph or the Hebrews, as they were sharp reminders of the foreign rule of the despised shepherd kings. It is also no wonder that he wanted to cull their population and control their influence by placing them under harsh administration and the imposition of enforced labor. He didn't want another shepherding people to have any possible foothold in the building of a new government or the usurpation of the Egyptian throne. This wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of pharaonic responsibility from the Egyptian perspective. He kept his friends close and his enemies even closer and much more controlled. So when you hear the stories of the Pharaoh enslaving the Hebrews, of the Pharaoh putting out the edict to have babies thrown into the Nile, to cull the herd, so to speak, of the Hebrews, this wasn't to be cruel to the Hebrews. This was to be smart as the king of Egypt. So, right, Jama says, keep them separated. Exactly. Just in DC, that was totally copycatted. Not sure what that is. Scotty, I got to go to the goat farm. I'll catch you on the rebound. Have a good night, Jeannie. Good to see you here. Exodus 1, 8 through 10 says, Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we have to deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become even more numerous. And if war breaks, listen to this, if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. Exodus 1, 8 through 10. So the mud brick capital of Egypt, the moisture-laden green fields, humid air, and flowing canals, whose banks were filled with the bulrushes and palm trees of the delta, were a welcomed respite for the pharaoh and his family, who relocated there from Thebes during the hot summer months. Their royal residences in Menepher on the Nile, renamed from the older city of Hatkapta, there you go. Get the pronunciation right on the wrong syllable. Were an annual delight in comparison to the burning sun and blowing sand of the dry, arid, sparkling royal city of Thebes. The name Menepher meant enduring and beautiful in the Egyptian tongue, which is why it was not only the capital of Egypt, but also the place where Theban pharaohs enjoyed respite at their summer palace. It was nearly a week's journey north from Thebes to Menepher, floating more than 400 miles with the northerly current of the Nile, which dispersed into the delta and eventually emptied into the Mediterranean Sea. At least the trip to Menepher was with the current, making the annual commute smooth and swift. Conversely, the journey back south against the river's flow made their autumnal return to the city seem much longer and much more tedious. Menepher is also known as the Good Place, which eventually became known by its adulterated Greek name Memphis, was an old and great city sprawling at the mouth of the Nile Delta under the protection of its patron god Ptah. It was originally named Enebu Hedju, the city of the white walls. Built by Pharaoh Menes around 3000 BC, along with the great temple of Hekapta, the enclosure of the Ka of Ptah. Menepher's bustling port of Perunifer was thick with the noise and smells of industry, with workshops, factories, such as they were in 3000 BCE, and warehouses lining the riverfront. Menepher was the main distribution port for food all throughout the kingdom, whose cities, villages, and centers of population clung to the banks of the Nile from Nubia to the Mediterranean. And I showed you this the other day during the reading, and it's black and white again, but this is the main drag of modern-day Memphis, ancient Menepher. And there are ruins all over the place and buildings and little villages all around. But this is the main drag. It's kind of like going into a little town when you're driving through like Illinois or Indiana or Georgia. And you go through those little towns that last about a block or two long with the 1 or 2 story buildings, and that's it. So this is my picture. Again, I don't have the software to do this yet, but one of my pictures of downtown Menepher or Memphis. And that's about all there was to it. So, although stone was ported up from places such as Gebel el Silsila Now, it's interesting. My friend John Ward, who is a British archaeologist, and he and his wife, Dr. Maria Nilsson, who's the mission director there, have the archaeological site of Gebel El Silsila. It was a big stone quarry and has been for thousands of years. And so it was Gebel El Silsila would ship sandstone blocks up from, well, downriver, really north, up to Mennefer, to Thebes and to Mennefer. So Mennefer was considered to be the capital of the mud brick making. Boatloads of sun-dried Delta mud brick shipped out every day to the numerous building projects up and down the river. Let's see. I'll flip the page over. By the way, we made, I think I showed you this picture as well. It's in one of the color sections of the book where John Ward and I spent an afternoon making mud bricks in the city of Combe. It's a village of Combe, which is south of Luxor, so way down south in Luxor. But there we are. See if I can get that up there right. Again, really, pardon me for my hokey way to show these things off. But there we are, a little over ankle deep in mud and straw, drinking coffee, smoking cigars, and making mud bricks. So that's what that looked like. So we had a good time with that. Now, and by the way, all the Egyptian workers absolutely loved that these guys, we weren't well dressed. We weren't, how would I put that? John had his tweed suit coat and khakis, and I had on khakis and a linen shirt. We're wearing our fedoras, smoking cigars, drinking coffee, and all the little kids all got the biggest fun kick out of seeing us making bricks. And the master brickmaker there, all muddy, came up and he gave me a big, fat, wet, juicy kiss on the cheek. So that's the way they show affection over there. So we had a good time with them all. So, and of course, John knew all these people. The guy that was in charge of the brickyard was a guy that had done a lot of carpentry work and masonry work and mud brick wall work on John's house in Luxor. So John was a permanent resident there, so people knew him. So we had a good time with it. Let's see. From both his palace in Thebes and his summer palace in Mennefer, Pharaoh Ahmose I, also known as Ahmose I, Amenes, Ahmes, and also Nebpetira, reigned from 1550 to 1525, thereabouts, according to the Oxford Chronology of Egyptian Kings. Egyptologist and author David Rohl suggested a new chronology that would place Ahmose I's reign from 1194 to 1170, 400 years later. But this has been rejected by the majority of Egyptologists, even prior to the release of radiocarbon dating released by the journal Science in 2010. Ahmose, and by the way, David Rohl, I have to say, brilliant scholar, linguist, Egyptologist. He worked on the movies Patterns of Evidence. Audrey knows him, and so few people know who he is, David Rohl. But he created, for me and many others, he did the big taboo. He created his own chronology, a fifth chronology of the Egyptian kings, chronology of the Egyptian kings, in order to fit his needs to make a dating system work. And so most Egyptologists reject his, and I think they have totally discarded it now, his fifth chronology of the Egyptian kings, which is too bad because David is so brilliant in so many other ways. But he was wrong about his chronology. All right, there we go. Where'd Kirk go? Says Macabremens. Macabremens. Nice. Macabre Menace. Where'd Kirk go? I'm not quite sure what that's relating back to, but hey, dude, shout out. Good to see you, Mac. Macabre, and Amanda. Nice to see you here. Captain Nelson went to destroy peeps on Egypt. Yes, he did. So good to see you guys here as well. Sterling, yes. I always use your screen name first until you tell me go ahead and use my actual name. So Sterling, good to see you here. And Amanda, good to see you here too. And Suze, I think you gave me permission to use your name. I already said hi to you, but hi again. Somebody else with a different screen name. I always use my name when I do things. I think it's because I'm an author and I have so many things I do that have my name attached to them. I just use my own name because I don't care. So anyway, there we go. So all of that about David Roll's alternative chronology of the Egyptian kings. Ahmose the First completed the defeat and the expulsion of the Hyksos and reunified Upper and Lower Egypt, becoming the absolute ruler of the United Egypt. By ousting the Hyksos, he reestablished Theban rule and reasserted Egyptian power in the formerly subjugated regions of Nubia and Canaan. By the way, if you look at any relief illustrations on Egyptian temples and papyrus and things like that, if you see pictures of the crown where they've got the white crown, the base of the crown going around and coming down and around the ear, you got this white crown with this big red cone, kind of looks like the shape of a gourd almost, and it's bright red. This white and red crown was a symbol of unified Egypt, unified Upper and Lower. So one of the symbols. So Scotty and his Enterprise bridge. Yes, here we are. Thank you. So which temple in Egypt is popular? Because they just found another underneath it. Underneath which one, Charlie? Looking back a little bit. This is my infancy favorite subject. Thank you, Scotty. You're welcome, TT. Charlie, which temple in Egypt is popular? Oh, there's a lot of them. If you go to Egypt, the temples that are really the most popular, you hear the most about, are Luxor Temple, and 3.5 miles down the road, straight line down the road, is Karnak Temple Complex. And it's got all kinds of 26 or more temples within the temple complex. So let's move on. I'll move on, and you can put your questions in there if you've got them. Let's see. By ousting the Hyksos, he reestablished the Theban rule and reasserted Egyptian power in the formerly subjugated regions of Nubia and Canaan. And he set about sweeping all remnants of the presence of the repugnant shepherding kings, the Hyksos, from Mennefer. So the Hebrew people who had come to Egypt, serving several generations past to avoid the harsh famine in Canaan, found a new homeland given to them by the Hyksos pharaoh. But now they were nothing more than a despised people who bore the guilt of association and benefit at the hands of the invading Hyksos, the shepherd kings. And by invading, I mean invading because infiltrating would have been a better use of the word, because they didn't invade. There wasn't a military raid. They just took over in the north. Let's see. It was not a good time to be living in Egypt for these nomadic emigrants from Syria and Canaan. The new pharaoh, Ahmose I, saw them as a blight and feared that because they had grown so exponentially, they would be a force to be reckoned with, if not subdued immediately. So in a great administrative reorganization, Ahmose cleansed Egypt of the Hyksos influence and began massive new building campaigns to reconstruct Egypt in a new glory. He reopened the quarries that had lain stagnant for generations and opened up the mining in the Sinai, reestablishing the trade routes throughout Egypt and improving the Grand Canal of the Pharaohs, stretching east along the Wadi Tumilat down through Lake Timsah and the Great Bitter Lake to the Sea of Reeds, across the northern tip of the Red Sea and into the Sinai Desert. Now, if you did like I suggested and went to someplace like Google Earth, or go to Google Maps, or one of your big worldwide satellite map images, go to Egypt and look up the Wadi, Wadi, Tumilat. And Tumilat is spelled, just to get it right here, I'll look at how I've got it spelled in the book. I would say Tumilot, Tumilat. I believe that's how it's spelled. Now I lost my place where I saw it. So the Wadi Tumilat. And you'll see, if you were looking at a map of Egypt right now, which I can't call up, or I just pointed out to you, there's one in the book later on. But you know what? Hang on. I want to do this. I want to take this rabbit trail. Let me see where it is in the book here, because I want to show you this map. I think it's right before one of the color sections here. Yeah, here it is. Okay. I'm going to show you something here on this map. This was a glorious map in color, but of course it's black and white in the book. I should have put it in one of the color sections. But I'll tell you this, as an artist, you save all your stuff as you're working on it. And I actually went in, and now I lost the thing I'm trying to grab here. I lost it, the color version. I accidentally saved over it, and it pissed me off. But here, I'll just use that. Stick that in there. Now, this map, I'm going to use a little pointer here. Again, pardon my lack of technology with the with my software. One of these days, I'll get around to looking it up. Okay, look at this. Here's your map of Egypt. I made this map, and I did it in color at first, and I lost the color, so it's in the book in black and white, in the black and white section. But Luxor, or Thebes, is all the way down here. You're 500 miles south of Cairo. Present-day Cairo is right up here. Now, Goshen just goes off to the east of Cairo. This is where Avaris was, and Pi-Ramses. And here you see Mennefer, or Memphis, is right here. I'll try to get a little closer. Mennefer was right here. You're about 30 miles from Cairo here in this little stretch. And the pyramids are out here. Giza, it's right out here. Down here, you've also got the stepped pyramid of Djoser and all of that, which was all there at the time of Moses. Now, the Wadi Tumilat is this, coming from Goshen, there's this, if you can see kind of behind here, it's this arc of fertile land. It's a wash one time a year. It fills with water and it stays green, but this is also a trade route that they would follow even back then. So I believe the Hebrews left from Goshen after the night of Passover. In the morning, they left, the Exodus began, they left Egypt, and they took the Wadi Tumilat from Goshen and ended up here. See the north tip of the Red Sea? Here it goes into these Bitter Lakes and the Sea of Reeds. And this is where they ended up, was right here on the Bitter Lakes. And they would have crossed here, I believe, and gone all the way down here and over to Serebet el Khadim, which we'll get into later, which is right in here, I think. If I'm looking at it backwards on my screen. And of course, Thebes is way down here. John's theory has them leaving Thebes and somewhere here from Luxor, crossing through the eastern desert and crossing up here at the Red Sea somewhere, narrow point. But this is a huge stretch of water. I have a reason for a theory here that it all happened up here in the Bitter Lakes. So that's the Wadi Tumilat. That's worth looking at because I keep referencing it. Let's see. Charlie says, "Oh my God, Scotty, it was in Thebes. They found the hidden pillars of another hidden temple and blocked off to tourists." I'm not sure which one you're referring to there, but I do know that there's that kind of stuff going on all the time in Egypt. I'll have to look that up and see which one you're talking about. Did you know that John and Maria at their site, if I were to show you that map again, it's not on this map. It's way south of this map. But if you go south of Thebes about 100 miles, you hit John and Maria's site of Gebel El Silsila. And they discovered a temple there just a couple of years ago, the Temple of Kheny, Kheny. And so that was a missing temple for a while, if you will, missing. Now, let me get back to where I was. And, all right. Let's pick up before my rabbit trail here. Okay. Let's see. Jama says it's a good theory. I think it's a very good theory. I think there's a lot of earmarks that place the Exodus leaving from or taking place in the time of the plagues, the time of Moses, the birth of Moses, most of his life, the deeds of Moses, um, the happenings of the 10 plague in that period of time, the leaving of Egypt along the Wadi Tumalat. I believe that's where this all took place. And there is actually, we'll talk about it when we get there, but I don't believe they crossed the Red Sea. I believe they crossed the Sea of Reeds and the Bitter Lakes region, which was shallow lakes. And there's a reason I believe there's a geologic event that takes place there, a rare geologic event that to me makes Moses a lucky dude or an opportunist. And we'll get into that another time. So, all right. So he reopened all these quarries and that had lain stagnant for generations. He opened up the mining in the Sinai, reestablished the trade routes throughout Egypt. Ahmose the First improved the Grand Canal of the Pharaohs, stretching east along the Wadi Tumalat down through Lake Timsah and the Great Bitter Lakes to the Sea of Reeds, across the northern tip of the Red Sea and into the Sinai Desert. Ahmose forcibly breathed the air of Egypt back into the lungs of the Nile Delta. Not only had he driven out the usurpers, but he would be the pharaoh known for building an even greater Egypt than had existed before. But all of this required the living, breathing, pulsing, technological machinery of his day, the blood, sweat, and tears of a human workforce. Not only did Ahmose the First incorporate the talents of raw loyalty of his Egyptian craftsmen and workers, but he also found it in the Hebrews and other Asiatic peoples dwelling in the Delta region, a sizable workforce of which he took great advantage. As previously described, there was no love for the Hebrews and other Semitic peoples living in the Delta, and Ahmose the First and his successors imposed harsh labor on them, forcing them into servitude, pressing them into work camps, into the quarries along the Nile and the copper and turquoise mines in the mountains of the western Sinai Desert. And by the way, I'll show you this here. Little hard to see it here in black and white, unless you're holding a book in your hand. I mentioned very early on in this broadcast tonight, at the beginning of the broadcast, if you go to the graphic for tonight's program, and it shows the Egyptian workers painted in relief. This is one of those images is here, and it shows the different colored skins that they put on the workers here. You can see it in black and white here. You can see this guy's lighter, this guy's lighter, these guys are darker. There's Nubians mixed in with the color that the Egyptians painted the Asiatics, the Canaanites, the Middle Easterners, a yellow skin color. So you can look at that graphic I put up. That's a photo I took in the tomb of Rekhmir, the Grand Vizier to Tutmosis III and Amenhotep II. So go take a look at that at your leisure. Let's see. Not only did okay, I already went through that, and I flipped the page. By the way, this is the mud brick making. The foreman there. That's where we were making bricks that day. That's the guy who kissed me. Let's see. So, nearly a century later, after Ahmose the First, Pharaoh Tutmosis III was still utilizing Semitic peoples as a workforce. Rekhmir, vizier to Tutmosis III, and subsequently to his son Amenhotep II, left behind beautifully detailed paintings on the walls of his tomb among the tombs of the nobles in Thebes, current-day Luxor, depicting Semitic workers making mud brick and carving blocks. The accompanying hieroglyphic text reads, "He supplies us with bread, beer, and everything good. while the Egyptian taskmaster is saying, "The rod is in my hand, be not idle." Although it's been well established by Egyptologists throughout the last 200 years that much of the construction work carried out in ancient Egypt was by communities of indigenous workers whose entire lives were dedicated to the glory of their pharaohs, in the New Kingdom we see a shift in workforce to that of pressing the foreign inhabitants of the land into enforced servitude. And it seems apparent that the offspring of those foreign workers were simply born into a veritable slave caste, proliferating the exponential population of the forced laborers. There are also many references to prisoners of war being hauled back to Egypt from foreign campaigns in Nubia, Syria, and Canaan, where soldiers and other inhabitants were brought to Egypt for the express purpose of pressing them into forced slave labor. The big question is, are any of these foreign blooded slaves the Hebrews? Are they the descendants of the family of Jacob that were given fertile land in the Delta region under the rule of the foreign kings who had usurped the northern throne of Egypt? Although there's no direct evidence of Jacob's clan and descendants, I think we have, via secondary archaeological evidence, established that this possibility flies off the top of the plausibility scale. And in a nation that didn't give a lot of attention to the particulars of whom they considered as enemies of the state, other than to mention them by regional affiliation and origins, such as the term Asiatics so profoundly demonstrates, they did not separate them out by family clan names, such as the children of Jacob, Israel. And if they ever did, those records are lost to antiquity. But now it seems highly improbable that any pharaoh or scribe would have called out the Hebrews, the descended family tree of a migrated group of Canaanite tribesmen, by their family name of Israel, and that it was simply just never recorded. And if Joseph and his father's clan and his brothers were given the land in the Delta, those records, if they ever existed on papyri, are simply lost to the humid, flooding climate of the Nile Delta. So, next section. Is the Bible a reliable historical source? The questions of a Hebrew presence has to solidly rest on whether or not the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the writings of Moses known as the Pentateuch, the Jewish Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, can be accepted as historical documents, or at the very least, while being books of faith, present facts that can be established through plausible secondary archaeology. We have hit hard on this point already, but it's worth reminding ourselves again right here that just because an ancient document is spiritual or religious in nature, that should not preclude its contents from being considered as reliable history. But the proof is in the pudding, as the ubiquitous they contend. Establishing historical plausibility is then the primary means in establishing biblical authenticity of record. So, let's see if we got anything going here that I need to jump into. My dad said the Bible is true because the Jews are still on the earth. Well, the Christians are still on the earth. The Muslims are still on the earth. The Muslims, the Arabs, were Jacob and Esau. Remember them? The sons of Isaac in the Old Testament. Jacob is Israel. And Esau, his brother from whom he stole his birthright, became the father of the Arabic tribes. So the legend goes. So the Bible is true. The faith stories, I think, harder to prove because they're faith issues, they're spirituality. But the history has been proven time and time and time again. So, yeah, I get that, Jama. I'm just making a point. So, let's see. American scholars William Albright and John Bright, what a pair to work together, huh? Albright and Bright, or Bright and Albright, contended that the biblical record is reliable in its historical presentations. When coupled with secondary historical data, it gives us a very authentic picture of Hebrew history. In A History of Israel, 1959, John Bright, a student of Albright's, maintained this biblical authenticity. In the third edition of his book, and I've got it sitting here somewhere, which came out in 1981, he stated emphatically from a faith-based position, quote, "There can really be little doubt that ancestors of Israel had been slaves in Egypt and had escaped in some marvelous way. Almost no one today would question it," end quote. And there is a footnote for that. So many footnotes in this book. So what do you do when faith runs headlong into science? There's the big question. The two trains running toward each other at full speed on the same track. This is the ever-present debate that exists in every field of scientific study. Do we accept carte blanche the teachings in a book of faith, or must we balance those teachings against what we know by research and scientific study? I think we all know the answer is in the latter. Acceptance by faith is a matter of heart and belief, whereas the examination of fact must be applied. A scholarly seminarian professor friend of mine once said, quote, "Remember, Scotty, in all of your historical research, you cannot forget to maintain the Bible as your filter," end quote. Solid scholar, but he was telling me to use the Bible to filter my history. That is an act of faith, folks. This is good advice from a seminary professor, but it's clearly a statement of faith. Using the Bible as your only means of filtering historical data can lead to a dangerous end and sometimes to unfounded conclusions, no matter what you wish to be true or what aligns with your religious beliefs. By the way, I inserted a picture here. Scotty on his first ferry ride across the Nile from the west to the east bank of Luxor. Ancient Thebes with Luxor Temple in the background. That's stuck right in here. I can't remember why I put that there exactly. That's a much better picture in color as well. But I'm on the ferry going from the West Bank and John's house, and right there you see Luxor Temple. That's where we're going on the waterfront. 5-minute ride across the Nile. So in Luxor, Egypt, maybe that's why I put that there, this last January, the authors were at dinner with a Muslim friend. We'll call him Syed to hide his identity. The topic of this book came up for discussion at the table, and we all had a sincere, frank dialogue. In the discussion, Syed, a business owner, an overall intelligent man, asked questions and posted theories. But when it came to the bottom line, he raised his hands and calmly said, "The Holy Quran says it is so, and that is then fact." We respectfully asked him how he would act if he learned that historical data contradicted or even controverted the writings in his holy book. He simply raised his eyebrows and a sincere, friendly smile repeated his previous statement to the word. We agreed that we respected his faith and would push the issue no further in that conversation. Now, I had the same conversation with another Muslim friend of mine, scientist, archaeologist. He was the chief inspector of John and Maria's site of Gebel El Silsila out of Komombo, the Komombo Inspectorate. And I've talked about him before. Gregarious man. If you saw the Indiana Jones movies and you know the character Salah, Indiana Jones' friend in Egypt, he reminded me of Salah. Kind of looked like him, was big, gregarious. He spoke like this. And I remember one morning I'm staggering up from the cabin below deck and just not quite awake yet, looking for coffee. And he's already sitting on the deck. And he says to me, he yells out, "Scotty, me boyo." He says, "Come and drink coffee with me and let us have repast and conversation." And he always reminded me of Salah. "Asps, very deadly. You go first." And so, but he gave me the same answer. We had a great conversation one day. We were floating all day long up the Nile. We were traveling up the Nile to the south, from Komombo to Aswan. And he sat and asked me about my faith. And I've talked about this during these readings before, but he asked me about my faith, and we got to talk, and I asked him these same questions. He gave the very same answer when I asked him, what would you do if your faith and your science conflicted? And he did well, Scotty, he says, my faith is here and my science is here. I never let them meet. And that's pretty much the way they were. Let's see. Just looking through some of the comments over there. Okay. Let's see. But herein lays the problem with the matter of faith. When seeking answers to historical mysteries and questions, we're not seeking truth. We're seeking fact. Now, fact and truth might be the same thing to some people. But in other words, we're not seeking spiritual truth. We're seeking scientific or historical fact. No matter what our faith may tell us, we must defer to available facts and data. This does not mean that there's not more things to discover on any given matter, but that when researching, all biases must be left at the door. For instance, in searching for facts that may establish the biblical record, the faith issue must be checked and balanced against historical data. And if the established grounded data is in conflict with Scripture, it must be concluded that the Scripture is either completely wrong or there are explanations and more data to be found. In other words, the historical fact cannot be controverted by an issue of faith. That faith is the random element brought to historical fact. And I'm talking about established fact, mind you. This is not an abandonment of faith and belief. It's a suspension of religiously held dogma in order to take an objective view of researched, uncovered data. So, boom, that's what we have to do. Man, Scotty, this would make for great reality TV. John and I tried that. We were actually approached after writing this book by a couple of producers with A&E who worked with our agent for a while, and we even filmed and put together. If you go to my website, ScottAllenRoberts.com, scroll down a little ways on the main page, you'll see a video. You can watch it. It's right here on my page. If you go here on my YouTube page to my Egyptian videos, I think the first one in that line is the History Troopers trailer. That's what we had filmed for a potential series that did not get picked up. That was about 4 years ago. We were working on that, and we were given very positive pats on the back type of rejections. The president of Nat Geo Television said he loved John and me. He loved our presentation, what we were doing, but they weren't picking up that kind of show right now. Circle the wagons, he said, come back in a year, and we just never did it. So, but you can see some of the trailers we put together by taking a look at things right here on this. You can go to my website, see it there. You can go to Audrey, if you catch this, historytrippers.com. And you'll see some videos and things there. You can click and see our written presentation that all the photos in it and things like that, and the series structure. That's all there to take a look at. historytrippers.com. So thanks, Lewis, for mentioning that. Let's see. Conversely, the same must be said for science and academia. Simply because historical data already exists ought not to preclude the filter of religious work, as they represent a body of history all on their own. Any previously held acceptance of archaeological data, if contradicted or even controverted by faith-based data, must be open to the possibility that there may be more to the research than what meets the eye with black and white facts. It is the modus operandi of the academic community to label any faith-based argument that cannot be established by cold hard fact as simply wrong. In a real sense, academicians can be as religious as those who operate by faith alone. Agendas and previously held belief systems must be left behind when researching for factual data. This does not mean they ought to be abandoned, for many discoveries are driven by the desire to either substantiate or disintegrate theoretical or faith-based claims. The key is not to be beholden to one or the other. A researcher simply has to be a researcher. Even when it comes to the story of Moses and the Exodus, a thematical theory based on the books of 3 of the world's major religions. The notion is that there is something to those stories as contained in those books, hence the 2 centuries of repeated quests of discovery into the topic. But neither academic, I gotta check the time, we're good, but neither academia nor faith should drive the search for fact. Academic positioning comes with evidential proof, whereas faith needs no proof at all to substantiate whatever it believes. You notice that? Science requires a hell of a lot of digging and research. Faith doesn't require any. You just have to state it. So let's see. Just going to see if I missed something there. Blah, blah, blah. Nope. Scandinavian minimalist Niels Peter Lemke, that's it, Lemke, states the silence in the Egyptian sources as to the presence of Israel in the country is an obstacle to the notion of Israel's 40 years sojourn. American scholar Bernard Bato said, the biblical narrative in the books of Genesis through Joshua owes more to the folkloric tradition, to the folkloristic tradition of the ancient Near East than to the historical genre. There's always presupposition brought to the table. The biblical scholars presuppose the scriptural tales are real history, while the academics presuppose they simply never really happened, but are part of a folklore tradition. What we give you in these pages is a mix of the two. We cannot state emphatically that the faith story never happened, but we must adhere to the current academic discovery, even if it contradicts issues of faith. Now, this is why I've told this story on a couple of radio shows recently. I've told it here when I talked about sentiment, my experience, things that I would consider visions, which I'm not given to. I'm not that kind of guy, never was before I had them, that kind of guy. And I always looked down on people who had them as being phonies, fakes, too wrapped up in their emotions, et cetera, until I had one. And I will tell you this, is that the story I had that established certain things for me about Senenmut are things I could not put in this book because they were not academic fact. Academicians would look at that and scoff at it, guffaw. Oh, you had a vision? Really? And that's what you're basing your theory on? No, it's something that establishes for me on a different level some of my theories. So that's why I mentioned at the beginning of this book, in my own preface to this book, that there were things that happened that I could not mention within the pages of this book. That's one of them. That would be an issue of faith, if you will, of spirituality, an experience, an anecdotal experience that took place and happened only to me and nobody else writing this book. And so that's where I had experience that establishes certain things for me, as opposed to having all the facts in hand. But I could never use that to prove my case. It proves it to me. So, 72 rabbis and a pharaoh walk into a room. It's the next section. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, having no more worlds to conquer, he left the world in a very Hellenized state, in which the universal language of commerce was Koine Greek, the same language with which most of the biblical New Testament is written. As legend tells, the Macedonian pharaoh of Egypt, Ptolemy II, who ruled from 309 to 246 BC, sponsored the translation of the Jewish Torah and related texts from the biblical Hebrew into Greek for inclusion in the Library of Alexandria. I feel like I've read this before. I might have talked about this or spoke about this in something else I was doing and took this excerpt. The translation took place in several stages over many years, but the result was to give us the Septuagint or the Septuaginta, the Greek version of the Old Testament that is the basis for the Old Latin, Slavonic, Syriac, Old Armenian, Old Gregorian, and Coptic versions of the Christian Old Testament. So in essence, you pick up a Bible today, you look at the Old Testament, you're basically reading an English version of the Septuagint. After the Torah, other books were translated throughout the next 2 to 3 centuries, but it's not even clear which book was translated when or where that translation took place. There is even some evidence that some of the books included may have been translated more than once into distinctly different versions and then revised again from that point. Let's see. I've got a quote and I've got a footnote here. Couldn't tell you right without going to look up the footnote where I took it from. But King Ptolemy once gathered 72 elders. He placed them in 72 chambers, each of them in a separate one, without revealing to them why they were summoned. He entered each one's room and said, "Write for me the Torah of Moshe, your teacher." God put it in the heart of each one to translate identically as all the others did. Now I've got to look that up and see what the source of that is. This is chapter 5, and it is footnote number 15. Let's just take a look here. Chapter 5. This is the Tractate Megillah. How about that? It's an ancient document because there's no authorship, no nothing else mentioned here. So, the Tractate Megillah. Have to look that up because I've just got it listed in the footnote by that alone. Let's see if it's in the bibliography. Hang on a second here. Oh, that's the Talmud. The Tractate Megillah and the Talmud. There you go. That's where that source came from. All right. So one of the problems encountered with the Septuagint is that the quality and style of the different translators varied considerably from book to book, sometimes offering up a literal translation, then sometimes jumping from paraphrasing to outright interpretive. This has caused many scholars to see the Septuagint as a work of not simply re-recording ancient Hebrew scripture, but of rewriting certain texts to support the national identity of Israel and appeal to the faithful adherents of Judaism. It is from this Greek translation of the Old Testament that we have most of our current English version. Hebrew manuscripts still exist, but not in their original form, and it is this repeated translation of the Old Testament that has left us with questions as to authenticity and veracity to the original documents, if they existed at all. And by the way, the legend doesn't deal with the Septuagint itself, as we have copies of this document in many other forms. The legend is focused on whether or not it was Ptolemy II's invite or the 72 rabbis simply came begging on the doorstep of the Library of Alexandria and were granted permission. The skeptical atheistic community's periodical Free Inquiry takes the stance that none of this ever happened at all, and it was completely fabricated. And I've got a footnote there showing where they said that. So in reality, we have no real substantive proof of what Moses penned in his original books. Further, we have no hard evidence as to whether Moses even lived. According to the true scientists, we need to approach the notion of there being an historical Moses and an equally historical event known as the Great Exodus, as if he never really existed in the first place. The absence of any direct evidence of existence will tell you is the absence of existence. They will tell you is the absence of existence. Let me repeat that. The absence of any direct evidence of existence, they will tell you, is the absence of existence. The biblical record is not direct historical evidence, as it's a book of faith. And absent any historical record there is, they conclude no Moses. He's a figment of Jewish fiction, an element of Canaanite folklore. But then again, so are Joseph, Jacob, the Hebrews, and all of the fanciful notions of Egyptian bondage, miraculous deliverance, and the conquest of the land of Canaan. But all of this presupposes that the Bible and the writings traditionally held to be those of Moses have no real historical value. And as a result, you should, if you are a critical thinker of any sort, continually ask yourself why academia and science so discount the biblical record as having no historical value and no archaeological merit. A sample of name erasure from a lintel above a speos on the banks of the Nile at the west bank of the quarries of Gebel el Silsila. I've got this in here. I probably mentioned something about erasure here, but you can't really make this out very well here. This lintel will show you erasure. Now, I hadn't talked about erasure anywhere up to this point, so maybe it's on this last half a page of this chapter. But you see this lintel, and you see the wingspan here of this lintel over a doorway, and you see hieroglyphs, you see relief, and then you see these areas that are chiseled out in shapes. It's like they took the shape of whatever was there, chiseled it out. That's called erasure. To eliminate something that was there before, officially, and done in antiquity. Nelson Glueck, a noted 20th century Jewish archaeologist whose work in biblical archaeology led to the discovery of more than 1,500 ancient sites, put it this way. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a single biblical reference. Did you catch that? Out of 1,500 different ancient sites that he worked on, that he knew of their discovery, he said not a single archaeological discovery has ever controverted a single biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or in exact detail historical statements in the Bible. Now he's talking historical statements, not faith statements. Not surprisingly, as some think of the biblical record as being inaccurate and rife with faith stories alone, when stacked up against non-biblical accounts of historical events, the scriptural narratives reveal unflinching veracity. Here is something to consider. Perhaps Moses, in accordance with our contention that he was thoroughly Egyptian, despite being born of Hebrew blood, simply wrote the book of Exodus in a very Egyptian style. He didn't omit the names of the pharaohs because he was creating some sort of fiction. He left them out as to not give them life. In the ancient Egyptian way of thinking, the life eternal and the resurrection in the afterlife was archived through the recording of the name for all eternity to witness. By deliberately leaving their names out of the book, perhaps Moses, in his own way, was writing them out of eternity and out of history. That's why I had the erasure there. That's why they did that. And that's the end of that chapter. I got a few more things to say, and I want to go through our chat room. But the next chapter is John's thread, the Hapu thread. called Victims of Circumstance, and we're going to hit that one tomorrow night. Let me put a bookmark in here. Not that I can't find out where chapter 6 is, but let me just bookmark that. All right. So, I wish I could. I'm going to deftly try before tomorrow's show to get the software installed that I can show you pictures, so I don't have to hold the book up. But there are some things I haven't shown you yet. And as long as we're deep into the book here, I'm going to show you one of my favorite things about this book was we had so many photographs in this, maps and all kinds of things going on. But they gave us, New Page Books gave us 2 sections of color in here. So we have 16 pages of color. And when they started laying out the book, not bad-mouthing New Page Books, but they were doing white pages with little square pictures. And I said, no. I said, I publish a magazine. I've designed a magazine. I'm a designer. Let me handle the interior design. So I put together all these pages in the fashion that you see them here, so we could have something that was sweet to look at, eye candy. So I'm just going to show you a couple of things. This is Amenhotep, son of Hapu. This is a statue of him. This is John's candidate for Moses. And that's John over here, right there. British archaeologist. That's me. The Colossus of Memnon at Luxor. And this is Amenhotep, son of Hapu. This is John's guy for Moses. He believes he was an archetype, not a literal man born of Hebrew blood, but an archetype that played out. I just show some things here. We talked about Lake Malkata, the breaking of the walls of the sacred lake. This is just a tomb painting. I believe it was from Rekmir as well, of a sacred lake. John is here. This is the shrine of Alexander the Great at Karnak. And here we are at the walls of Lake Malkata, of that lake. And I just want to show you some pictures because it's kind of fun. We showed some of these. This is what's left of Lake Malkata today. The little village here of Qom. This is Lake Malkata, that exact spot with the palace out here, the ancient palace and the ruins out on the Sahara there. John's pointing out over the lake down here. This is the old map. We pointed this out a few days ago. Lake Malkata is right here. This is the walled lake that's split open and would have flooded Thebes down here. The temples are over here. So that's Malkata. We looked at some of this too, but these are in the background here, the big background shot spanning both pages, starting here with this big structure, and you see John all the way down here. That's one big picture. This is the city of the dead at Saqqara. And these are some of the different temples around. This is at Karnak. You see the ramps where the river would come right up to the temple, and they would disembark and embark from boats right there at Karnak. And of course, John, when we visited Giza, I call this shot the British archaeologist. So that's John as we were walking toward the pyramids. And then over in this other color section, it was more dedicated to my guy, Senenmut. And I'll give you a shot here. Some of these we've seen already, but this is Hatshepsut. I believe she was the young woman between 7 and 10 years old who found Moses in the Nile. And we go through all that. It's not as storybooky as it sounds. She became pharaoh of Egypt after co-regency with her son, her stepson, I'm sorry. And that's her funerary temple there of Deir el-Bahri. And I took all the shots in this, except the ones of me. John took them, or his wife Maria took them. This is Senenmut, much like the statue I have behind me. This was one of the statues, one of the 9 statues of him they found of him with the young Princess Nefruri. And there's me emerging from the workers' cave above Deir el-Bahri. which is right here. You see the cave. It's in the cliffside up there. And this is where it shows the, I don't know if I showed you this, if you can make it out there. Senenmut, my guy for Moses, shagging the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. One of the workers painted that on the cave wall 3,500 years ago. Then this is the temple at Karnak, the temple complex. This is the temple of Amenhotep II, my pharaoh for the Exodus. And when we went on into the Sinai, we went up to Serebet el Khadim, which is, you see in the big background picture here, this is Serebet el Khadim in the Sinai, as we were climbing up the mountain, going on the old processional paths. And it had all these temples up there and all these shrines to the pharaohs. And we found both our different pharaohs, our pharaohs of the Exodus that we think they were, and many other facts up there. This is where we believe the golden calf was made and all of that. Different from the tourist site, St. Catherine's out on the east of the Sinai. This page you saw because I showed some of this before. That's the temple of, that's John and me walking down the avenue of sphinxes, runs from the gates here of Luxor Temple, 3.5 miles in a straight line back behind us, all the way to the gates of Karnak Temple, with sphinxes lined all along the way. Making mud brick down in the Nilometer. These are inscriptions, relief paintings from some of the tombs. And this is me at, this is Karnak. And I'm looking through. This is where the shrine of Alexander the Great is. Inside there, that's Hatshepsut's, one of her obelisks. And you look all the way through that doorway. Can't make it out in this picture. But when you're there, that's a straight line from the porch of Amenhotep II's temple all the way through. You see a straight line, and you can see Hatshepsut's Deir el-Bahari and the cliff faces of the Theban Mountains, 3.5 miles away, that direction. So there's that. And then the final color picture, just John and I at Karnak Temple, and trying to do it so you don't get the reflection in your eyes. So this is just walking down some of the lanes inside the temple complex. So we were able to do that. It's fun. That makes the book fun. It's fun to hold. It's fun to read. And so on. I've got some of those available. If you want one, you can contact me through my website, through here, message me. We'll work something out. And I've got about a half a box of those down below here, below my feet almost. So let me just look through and see if there's anything we need to take a look at in the chat room. And we're pretty much going to wrap it up in a couple of minutes here. Let's see. Okay, I see. There's just other things going on there. I see that aren't so much in line with what we were reading tonight. That's okay. The chat room's a great place to share some ideas. I appreciate that. It's fun to see it. It's fun to see them. You can go back and play the chat room all over again if you listen to the show again. There's Professor Bauer. Was he in here tonight? Did I miss you? Greetings if you're here somewhere. And let's see. Did I show Professor Bauer that example of erasure? I think I did. There's erasure all over Egypt, Audrey, on every temple. And Hatshepsut, you see her actual form of her sitting on the throne, and it's all artistically chiseled out, her form. That was erasure. So they got rid of stuff. Let's see. I do have email. I don't know if there it is. Audrey put my email up, TT. Just Scott Allen Roberts, like my website, at gmail.com. And so you can use that one. And thank you, Fran. Yes, fun pictures from many trips. And by the way, if you go over to my Facebook page, as I mentioned, go into my photos, look at my albums, you start scrolling through dozens of albums from all the Egyptian adventures, and you can see a lot of this stuff in there. Let's see. And so Yeah, I'd love to have a metal detector and look through places too. So, hey, girl with no name. I think Becky, I think you told me your name was. If I've got that right, I might be wrong. I might be remembering wrong. Hasn't been, that's not a first. Becky, there you go. Spooner, by any chance, Spooner, Wisconsin, are you talking about? If you are, not far from where I am, over here in New Richmond, Wisconsin. So, everybody, thank you for being here. Yeah, thank you, Audrey. Awesome. There are a lot of awesome photos, a lot of fun. Go over to my website, scottallenroberts.com or historytrippers.com. You can take a look, or right here in YouTube, and you can go see some of my Egyptian videos. I don't have a lot of videos from Egypt. I took more pictures than I did videos. But if you just go to my video section here on my YouTube page, you'll see one that says Egyptian, I think it's Egyptian videos, something like that. There's the trailer for History Trippers is in there. A couple of other things that I shot. There are things that I shot with John Ward in Egypt, in the desert, going through places that I was requested by he and Maria to not show because some of that stuff is not published material yet for their site. And they have to be very careful about what they show before they show things or register them all with the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. I think they're a little, sometimes they're just a little touchy about that stuff, more touchy than they have to be. But I think they err on the side of safety than not. And so I've got a ton of stuff that would have been very cool for you to see. I've got a few videos up here on my YouTube page, though, from Egypt. Lewis says, silly question. Do they have good food in Egypt? Depends on who's doing the cooking. We had a great chef on board John and Maria's Dahabea. Dahabea is an old boat. You saw a big version of one in, if you ever watched the Mummy movies with, what's his name? Brendan Fraser. There's a big boat in the first movie that sank on the river or something. We actually saw that boat go by. It's a passenger boat down there. But a dahabea, that's what that is, a dahabea. And we stayed on a dahabea that had 10 cabins and a big stateroom down below deck. And the whole main deck was what John and Maria use in their seasons. In Egypt, you don't live on your site all year round. Now, you're given seasons that you can go work your site, which are in usually what I've seen with them 7-week periods. You can do 2 seasons a year. Sometimes they get 3 seasons a year, depending on the work they're doing. And they use this big dahabea, which is a Victorian era dahabea, by the way. And the whole deck, a wooden deck on top, it's about 25 feet wide, 20 feet wide by maybe 75 feet long. Open deck, but they put up the poles and the canvas tops and all that. It doesn't rain all that much there. The weather, you don't have to worry about weather. So it's all open air. But they put all their big desks and tables and their bookshelves and all their artifact collection shelves and things like that all along that top deck. And that's where we lived when I was there for a month at a time. I'd live on that. And you were asking, Lewis, do they have good food? We had a great chef, somebody that had worked for John in the past, and he does a great job of chefing there. And of course, we ate many times out of the little local cafes. There was one picture here where it showed the ruins of a temple, and there wasn't really even a road there. It's like a dirt alley. It's not really an alley. It's just the place where all the cars that go by there go, and there aren't many because it's right on the edge of the desert. But the ruins are here, and you just cross the little dirt road and you're over at Mohammed's Cafe. And we went there every day for lunch, and magnificent food, local stuff, chicken, different kinds of meats, vegetables, all of that stuff. We had a great time there. And a lot of the archaeological teams would come over there. So we'd be eating at 2:00 every day by clockwork. 2:00, the Russian archaeological team would come in. And so we got to know them. They invited us over to their dig, as a matter of fact. And so we went down and their tombs that they were excavating in the Valley of the Nobles. So yeah, there's some great places to eat. If you go into the big town, there's places to eat that are cool. There's a friend of John and Maria's, friends of theirs. She's a Brit. Her husband is Egyptian. They started a British restaurant of all things, called the Green. It's called the Lantern. I was thinking Green Lantern. It's not the Green Lantern. The walls are painted green on the inside, decorative green, but it's called the Lantern. British restaurant in Luxor, and a lot of expats that live in Luxor eat there. It's a great food when you're there. My designs over at Etsy.com. Thank you, Audrey. Go check them out. Shirts, hoodies, all of that. Get yourself some of this stuff. It's fun stuff. Go take a peek at least. See what you think. Let's see. And I think that's it. I think we'll be done. It's 11:15. Rocky Stucci and I go live in 15 minutes, 14 minutes actually, over at Rocky Stucci's Situation Room. And that's right here on YouTube. We're not doing the Facebook broadcast anymore. It's all going to be YouTube strictly. So go over to Rocky's page, Rocky Stucci Media. If you don't already know where that is, ROCCI STUCCI, Rocky Stucci, the Situation Room. I'm sorry, Rocky Stucci Media. And we'll see you over there in 15 minutes. See you back here tomorrow night. Thanks for being here. We'll hit chapter 6 tomorrow. Love you. I appreciate your being here and giving me your time. Hope you're enjoying it. Talk to you again tomorrow and a little later on Rocky's show. Good night.